12 שלבות של אור במקומות שחוללו בדם.
That's what it sounded like Monday night in Israel at the start of the national ceremony to end Memorial Day and usher in Israel's 76th Independence Day, although this year the ceremony had a very different look and tone because of October 7th. The first torch to be lit of the traditional 12 had a Canadian story behind it. The torch lighter was the aunt of Netta Epstein, the young Canadian-Israeli man who died in Kfar Aza on the day of the Hamas attack, by jumping onto a live grenade and covering it with his body. By doing so, he saved his girlfriend's life as they all hid from the Hamas terrorists who were pillaging and burning their kibbutz near the Gaza border. Israeli philosopher and author Yossi Klein Halevi wasn't in Israel this year to watch the national broadcast. Instead, he was in Toronto, where he's scheduled to deliver a talk at a Canadian synagogue on Tuesday with his prescription for how and why Israel got to October 7th, how the country responded, and what lessons Israel's muscular response to the terror attack should teach beleaguered Jews around the world now who are facing surging antisemitism, intimidation at work and online, campus tent encampments, boycotts, protests, even canceling of Jewish culture.
And we need really to extricate ourselves from this ping pong between victim and victimizer and reaffirm our identity as a strong, self-confident, and yes, vulnerable people.
I'm Ellen Besner, and this is what Jewish Canada sounds like for Tuesday, May 14th, 2024. Israel Independence Day, 76 years since the founding of the State of Israel. Welcome to the CJN Daily, a podcast of the Canadian Jewish News.
Is life really miserable for the Jews, or are we just glued to a 24-hour news cycle?
Should we be worried that so many young rabbis are coming out of seminary as anti-Zionists?
And what does Judaism say about polyamory?
If you want answers to these questions, well, we don't have any. But we do love asking them. Each week, tune into Bonjour Chai to hear debates and hot takes by me, Avi Feingold,
and me, Phoebe Maltz-Bovy,
as we sit down with pundits, rabbis, and scholars to talk about the most pressing issues facing Jews in Canada and around the world.
Listen and subscribe to Bonjour Chai at thecjn.ca/bonjour or wherever you get your podcasts.
Before we get into our interview with Yossi Klein Halevi, I want to tell you the results of our Jewish Heritage Month contest. Now, you might remember our episode on May 1st when we launched the contest about Jewish knowledge, and we asked listeners to write in and tell us if anything is Jewish about the popular summer camp ball game called Gaga. Well, we have our winners. Stay tuned to the end of the podcast to find out who won and the answer to our quiz. Now, many of you have already been following Yossi Klein Halevi. He does a popular podcast with the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, where he's also co-director of a program that trains American Muslim leaders about Israel. He was born in Brooklyn, New York, the son of a Holocaust survivor. Originally, he was an extreme right-wing zealot following Meir Kahane, but as he grew older and moved to Israel in the 1980s, the journalist began to explore relationships with Christians and Muslims. For decades now, he's been working on finding pathways to peace with Palestinians. Klein Halevi feels that despite how October 7th has now colored Jewish history with a wound and vulnerability he says we may never recover from completely, he is going to mark Israel Independence Day with a mixture of grief and gratitude. And he says you should too. Here's my conversation, which we taped just ahead of his Canadian lecture. It's an honor to have you at the CJN Daily. Welcome.
Delighted to be with you. Thank you.
Well, we're taping this ahead of Yom HaAtzmaut, but who better for us to have this discussion with? But before we do that, I think we should talk to our audience about your ties to Canada, because you actually have a job, a tie to a Canadian shul. Can you tell us just quickly what you're doing?
Yeah, I've been a scholar in residence at Temple Shalom in Vancouver. Rabbi Dan Moskowitz, Rabbi Carrie Brown, and it's been fantastic. I live in Jerusalem. I've been on an extended lecture tour for the last 2 months, and mostly in the U.S., but also in Canada. I have a daughter who's in Vancouver, so I'm using Vancouver as a base. I have an institutional home. I have family in Vancouver.
And why did your child move to Canada? It's none of my business, but why Canada?
Her then boyfriend and now husband was recruited by an animation company in Vancouver. And he went, and my daughter Moria followed Yam. They married. They have a daughter, Ella, our first granddaughter. And so there they are. You know, as we say in Israel, imkvar, if you already have to be somewhere outside of Israel, Vancouver is a pretty good place to be.
Okay, we should talk a bit about that, since it's an anecdote about your own family. They came before October 7th, right?
Yeah, they came about 6 years ago.
Right. Because we know since October 7th, hundreds of Israeli families with ties to Canada, some without, but friends, have come and live in Canada now. They've moved.
Yes.
And I wonder if you could speak to a brain drain.
I was deeply worried about a brain drain over the last year, going back to the beginning of the Netanyahu government's judicial plan. And there was serious talk throughout liberal Israel that if Netanyahu succeeds in turning Israel into a Jewish version of Hungary, then people will leave en masse, and certainly young people. Relocation, that became the new word. It began with Yerida, right? That was the first term. Then it became Hagira, immigration, and now it's relocation. And so there was this sense of despair that many Israelis, certainly in liberal Israel, felt. After October 7th, I became more hopeful. The country rallied in a way that we haven't seen since the Second Intifada, and maybe not since the Yom Kippur War. And the ability of Israeli society to instantly pivot from the most divisive year in our history to one of the peak moments of our collective purpose really gave me a lot of hope and made me feel that maybe that threat of mass immigration is behind us.
Can you speak to your previous research with dialogue with the Arab world and the Palestinians? You've written extensively about it. You've written books about it. What do you see after October 7th in Israel for real possibilities for peace? How polarized are the societies now after so much grief and bloodshed?
Well, Palestinians and Israelis have spent a lot of effort in convincing the other that they shouldn't trust the other side. And October 7th and the aftermath only intensified that. Neither side trusts the other, and both sides have earned that mistrust. Now, I am a very strong supporter of this war. I believe that on the one hand, this is Israel's ugliest war, most brutal war, and on the other hand, it's one of our most necessary and unavoidable wars. And that has made dialogue with Palestinians nearly impossible at this point. The only Israelis Palestinians might consider dialoguing with are those who are essentially ready to trade our narrative for theirs. And I'm not ready to do that.
What does that mean? What does that speak?
It means essentially becoming anti-Zionist, and it means positioning yourself against the state of Israel. And I wrote my book as a passionate Zionist, reaching out to Palestinians or anyone in the Arab or Muslim worlds who'd be prepared to consider engaging from that place of deep love and an affirmation of my people's story. And that for me is the only form of dialogue that has any chance of working. The so-called dialogue of far-left Jewish anti-Zionists with Palestinian anti-Zionists is a mockery of dialogue. And I was looking for a dialogue of respect among people who disagree with each other profoundly. Palestinians and Israelis disagree about every stage of this conflict, from the beginning of Zionism to what's happening literally today in Gaza. And so what I was hoping to do in this book is create a conversation about mutually exclusive narratives. And I found a few partners who are willing to engage in that conversation. And my premise was that this is a conflict between right and right, sometimes between wrong and wrong, but it's a conflict between two indigenous peoples, each of whom, in principle, deserves national sovereignty. And if you're ready to engage with me on the basis of that conversation, that I'm available for any disagreement that we may have. And since October 7th, even that disagreement has become nearly impossible. And I accept that. I accept the fact that I have made a conscious decision to affirm the survival and the existential needs of Israel above my commitment to dialogue. And what gives me hope is not necessarily what's happening in either society, but more what's happening in the region. It's surreal. On the one hand, large parts of the West are in the process of rescinding our legitimacy, our right to exist. And at the same time, significant parts of at least the elites, the political elites in the Arab world, are finally coming to terms, not just with the reality of our existence, but with the legitimacy of our existence. And the fact that Saudi Arabia is still committed to a process, not just of formal peace with Israel, but of normalization, is something that Jews should remind themselves of every day. Whenever we're feeling despair about the Jewish place in the world, the picture is so much more complicated. And so my hope is not necessarily a resumption of a bilateral Palestinian-Israeli peace track. In fact, I think that that is impossible. No basis for trust, for mutual trust. But there is the possibility of approaching the Palestinian conflict within a regional context. The fact is that Israel, for the first time, has Arab allies. We've never had that before. And it's possible to imagine some kind of peace agreement, not anytime soon, down the road, in which there is security arrangements, economic development, where Israel, together with our Arab allies, are working to neutralize the threat of a radical Palestinian state. It's still a long shot, but that was a scenario that didn't exist until a few years ago.
You said this is a long way away.
Yeah.
What does that look like in your nighttime dreams that keep you up?
Well, look, in Israel, a year from now is a long way. 10 years is inconceivable. So we're not speaking necessarily of decades. And I don't think we have decades to solve this problem. And, since October 7th, time has become elastic. I never know the date. Sometimes I have to remind myself what month it is. And that's true for everyone I know in Israel. There's a kind of a chaos in our ability to hold linear time. It's still October 7th. And we're in this time warp. And so I don't know how to answer your question. I can't imagine what's going to happen next week, let alone next year.
Talk to me about the trauma that Israelis are feeling on Yom HaAtzmaut. How are they going to get through when you have to go through these significant milestones of a nation, when you're grieving the loss of a son or a daughter or uncle or hostage?
I'll tell you a story about a friend of mine. His name was Arik Achmon, one of really the great, in many ways, unsung heroes of Israel. He was the chief intelligence officer of the paratroopers brigade that liberated the wall in 1967. He led the crossing of the Suez Canal in 1973, and that was the moment that turned the battle for Israel. Arik Achmon just recently died at the age of 90. He was one of my closest friends. The first Yom Ha'atzmaut after the Yom Kippur War, when Israelis were enraged at the government of Golda and Dayan and blamed them for the deaths of nearly 3,000 Israeli soldiers. And Arik, a kibbutznik and totally secular, and for him, Yom Ha'atzmaut was Yom Kippur. That was his holy day. And he told his wife, I can't do it this year. I can't celebrate. He said, I have some business abroad. And she said to him, Arik, go. He spent the eve of Yom Ha'atzmaut alone in his hotel room in New York. And he said to me, I wish I knew how to cry. And that was Yom Ha'atzmaut. The next year, he was back. But he did say to me, the celebrations were never again quite the same. He was able to begin to slowly return to the pretense of celebration, but it was never quite the same. Now, I think that this Yom Ha'atzmaut, we're not going to be able to celebrate. What I'm hoping for is to be able to be in touch with the gratitude that I feel for being an Israeli, the gratitude that I feel for having an Israel, especially after October 7th, when we got a glimpse into what it would look like to, God forbid, not have an Israel. The trauma of October 7th was it was a pre-enactment of what the destruction of Israel would look like. The border is overrun. The army is in complete disarray. Civilians are left to defend themselves. And so this Yom Ha'atzmaut, I'm going to, if not celebrate, I'm going to force myself to feel gratitude for the fact that we were able to turn October 7th around, not completely. And I don't know if we ever will turn it around completely. It's just going to be a permanent wound. I hope that wound will gradually contract, but it's not going away, not for this generation.
Is there anything that you want our Canadian audience to hear before your speech?
Thinking about what this moment means for us in Israel and what it means for you in North America, I think that we're going to need to adjust to a new reality that is defined by radical ambiguity. And by that, I mean, we are still an enormously powerful people. We could not do to Gaza what we did, and I don't apologize for that. We had no choice. But we would not have been able to devastate Gaza and to threaten Hezbollah and ultimately Iran if we were not a powerful people, if we were not a state that is, in the end, able to defend itself. And Jews in North America are still, despite everything, the most powerful diaspora in Jewish history. And to some extent, and I say this with caution, still reasonably accepted by a majority of your fellow Canadians. We're used to thinking in two categories, either victimhood or power. There's a third category, which is power together with vulnerability. And that's where we are in Israel today, and that's where you are in the diaspora. And we all woke up on October 8th realizing that we're nowhere near as safe as we thought we were. But after, at least in Israel, after 7 months of war, I think we realize that we're still able to hit back more strongly, to give better than we get. Now, in the diaspora, I would urge Jews not to despair and to proudly own your power, affirm your power. The great Jewish achievement of the post-Holocaust era was the transition from the lowest point in our history to a place of unprecedented power and centrality on the world stage, ability to take care of ourselves. This fight is just beginning. We are in a new phase. October 7th and the aftermath has opened up a new era of vulnerability. The post-Holocaust era is over. And we don't yet know what this era is called. But we are as strong as we've ever been. And we need to frankly own it without apology, without squeamishness. But that also means when you own your power, it also means realizing that you can't claim the identity of victim. And we're not a victim people. We don't belong in the world of intersectionality, in the world of DEI. We don't belong there because the Jewish people made a conscious decision after the Holocaust to reject victimhood, to reject the identity of powerlessness. And October 7th was the reminder of why we made that decision. And so on Yom Ha'atzmaut, we need to be grateful for the power we have and recommit to using our power in ways that will ease our vulnerability without reverting to the psychological condition of victimhood. We are not fighting the ghosts of the Holocaust. And yes, October 7th was a temporary relapse into the condition of powerlessness, and it lasted all of one day. But on October 8th, Israeli society made the decision not to allow powerlessness to stand. And this war is about reaffirming our ability to defend ourselves, whatever the consequences. For me, the framework of this time is not the Holocaust. And that's a very dangerous historical analogy for us to make. It undermines the historic achievement of Zionism, which was to negate victimhood. We did it. For me, October 7th is a Middle Eastern event. It needs to be understood in the framework of the Islamic State, of Iran. It's Hezbollah, it's Hamas, it's radical Islamism. It is not the Holocaust. And this is a moment to reaffirm the success of Zionism. And yes, we're paying an enormous price. And, we're in such a strange loop because so many Jews, understandably, if from my perspective wrongly, have lapsed back into the identity of victim. But for much of the world, we are seen as victimizers. And neither of those identities are adequate ways of understanding Israel and the Jewish people. We are not victims, and we're also not victimizers. We are a people that's fighting for its life. And that's different.
You may have been following the news here. B'nai B'rith Canada just released its audit of anti-Semitic incidents. The ADL Tel Aviv University, also released their own annual report on anti-Semitism in the diaspora. And they talked about things like, if this keeps up, the curtain is going to fall on a viability of living a free Jewish life in the West. 5,000 incidents in a country with 300,000 Jews is kind of weird.
5,000.
More, 5,700. This is incidents,
Right.
tweets and harassment and doxing and firebombings and Molotov cocktails. This is Canada.
Right.
So I wonder what you see in terms of the story that people know about what Judaism is and what Israel is in the diaspora, and where we went wrong and where you see the problem. Because Canada is spending millions on Holocaust education, Holocaust monuments, anti-racism training, and it's not working.
No, it's having the opposite effect. The Holocaust is now being turned against us. There was a demonstration at the gate of Auschwitz a couple of days ago against the March of the Living, a pro-Palestinian demonstration. Now, that's never happened before. Now, it was small, but symbolically perfect for this time. It really summed up what we're facing. The shamelessness, the transformation of our story from one of the most noble examples of human endurance and faith and triumph over adversity into the exact opposite. And so it's not working. Holocaust education is in Holocaust education outside of the Jewish community is a near total failure. And I think the main reason for that is that we went too far in universalizing the lessons of the Holocaust. The Holocaust is unique, is a unique event, but so is the hatred that made the Holocaust possible. Anti-Semitism cannot be conflated with racism. Now, obviously, there's a lot of overlap, but anti-Semitism works differently than other forms of racism. For me, the definition of anti-Semitism is the transformation of the Jews into the symbol for whatever a given civilization defines as its most detestable qualities. Under Christianity, until the Holocaust, the Jew was Christ killer. Nothing worse than that for Christianity. In Islam, the Jew was the killer of prophets. That's how we were referred to. And on and on. Under Marxism, under Nazism, the Jew represented the ultimate negative qualities. And today, living in a civilization that prides itself on anti-racism, the Jewish state emerges as the symbol of racism. And so we're looking at a pattern here, and that's what needs to be taught in Holocaust education. What is the specificity of anti-Semitism that makes it history's most enduring hatred, most malleable hatred, the hatred that is the most adaptable of all hatreds? And so in that sense, the irony is that Holocaust education helped prepare the ground for Israel emerging as the symbol of racism. And you hear this over and over again. We are opposing Israel in the name of the Holocaust. And you're the ones who are betraying the Holocaust. How dare you use the Holocaust? How dare you hide behind the Holocaust? We just heard it from Jonathan Glazer at the Emmys, that extraordinary moment, which for me, in its way, was as outrageous as a pro-Palestinian demonstration at Auschwitz. This is what Holocaust educators need to deal with now. There needs to be a fundamental rethinking of Holocaust education. Don't hold your breath.
Because it's such an institution.
Absolutely. And because it's the perfect means to convey the message, and basically any message. You have a problem with bullying in schools? Here's the Holocaust. Racism, the Holocaust. And right now, the Holocaust it is valid to use the Holocaust for any issue except protecting the Jewish people.
I'm honored that you spent this time with me, and it was really, really nice to meet you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And that's what Jewish Canada sounds like for this episode of the CJN Daily. We've put the link to Klein Halevi's Toronto event in our show notes. And meanwhile, as promised, we'll end with the unveiling of the winners of our Yom HaAtzmaut contest. First, here's the answer to the question about, is Gaga Jewish? Well, it does indeed have very Jewish origins. It's a kind of dodgeball played in a walled enclosure, and you're not supposed to let the ball hit you at or below the waist, or you're out. Legend has it that it originated in Israel in the 1950s and was then brought to North America and even Australia by Israeli summer camp counselors. Our two winners for a lovely CJN prize package are longtime listener Gary Capellas of Toronto is the runner-up, and the grand prize winner is Sofia Meya Perfiliev. She's 13, she's in grade 7 in Burlington, Ontario, and you can listen to all about her because she was profiled in the May 1st episode about winning the JewQ Chabad Jewish Knowledge Contest. Congratulations to both Gary and Sophia, and look in your emails. We'll let you know what you've won and how to pick up your prizes. Thanks for listening to the CJN Daily, which is produced by Zachary Judah Kaufman. Our executive producer is Michael Freeman, and our music is by Dov Beck-Levine.
Y'all remember that joke from Airplane? The old lady asked for some light reading.
How about this leaflet, famous Jewish sports legends?
But in actuality, that's changing. Jews are crushing it in sports around the world, and we are here to celebrate them.
Sandy Koufax gets his 10th strikeout.
Zach Hyman, his first career hat trick. 41 points for Diddy Avdia. It's Sue Bird's building.
I'm Gabe.
And I'm Jamie.
We love Jews and we love sports, but most of all, we love kvelling over Jews in sports.
Together we host Menschwarmers, the longest running Jewish sports podcast in the world. Listen and subscribe at thecjn.ca and wherever you find your podcasts.